Good evening, everybody. Back on a Monday evening, Monday night, about 10 to 8. I owe you two lectures, and so we're going to do two for one today. We're going to do both of Terence's plays, The Eunuch and the Mother-in-Law. Um, so we're back for some comedy fun. Another lighthearted, ripping yarn of love and intrigue and mistaken identity um, from the ancient comic stage. Um, Let me say a few things about Terence, the person. He's I think, one of the more interesting personalities from the ancient literary world. Um, he is quite likely to be our only surviving author of color from the certainly from the ancient Roman world. Um, and So you need to know a little bit about his backstory. He's of Libyan descent. Uh, he's Berber, if you know what that means. If you don't, look it up. Um, Probably not from Carthage itself, but probably from one of the tribes living around the city of Carthage. He is bought by a wealthy Roman senator and brought to Rome, where it is discovered that he actually has great talent. And because of his talents, he wins his freedom, which is pretty, unique. Usually, slaves who are freed. Like later in the semester, we're going to read a poet by the name of Horace, whose dad. So we refer to these people as freedmen or freedwoman. Um, Horace's dad was a freedman, but he had to work in order to purchase back his own freedom. So I'll talk more about the Roman practice of slavery when we get down to Horace, because when we do Horace and Juvenal, who I think are coming up pretty soon, we deal more with realities of daily Roman life. Um, but I'll talk more about that next time. Okay. So back to Terence. He was probably, there's different accounts of his date of birth given. It was likely to have been sometime between 195 and 185. And he dies in, I think, or is thought to have died in 154. He went off to Greece and never returned. So, maybe it was a shipwreck. I don't know. It would be appropriate from a comedy standpoint if it were a shipwreck, because that would put him directly in line with the man whose plays he adapts directly, Menander, um, um, who is also, according to the story, said to have drowned at sea. Well, where else would you drown? I guess in a river. Yeah, so drowned at sea. Good. I didn't get it wrong. I wasn't being redundant. Um, Terence wrote 6 plays. They all survive, which makes him pretty. I don't want to say unique outright, but puts him in select company um, amongst the surviving literature of the ancient world. Um, for most of the people who wrote, we only have fragments, and for the ones some of whose work survived, we only have some of their works. Survival rates are higher for Roman literature than they are for Greek literature. Why is that? Because Latin became the language of even after the fall of Rome, and as we progress into the medieval period, Latin becomes the language of learning. So when you are learning to read and write, you're taking courses in Latin. And Terence was very popular, because more popular than Plautus was, certainly, and was in some instances, and probably with only some light editing, considered a good school text. So again, because there are a few things, first of all, that go into that equation when just thinking about the compare and contrast between Plautus and Terence. Plautus's language tends to be more rollicking. He tends to be more inventive with the language. And whereas Terence is writing a crisper, cleaner kind of Latin. And again, this has an explanation to it. I think. I don't think it's because Plautus couldn't write that kind of Latin for his audience. But remember his audience. He has an outdoor audience. These plays are being performed at festivals. And Plautus himself, it is thought that his name, Plautus Titus Macius, is a stage name. So it appears that Plautus himself kind of grew up in the theater world, and so probably didn't necessarily receive the same level of formal education that Terence had. I know it sounds weird to talk about a slave being formally educated, but that was a practice in the ancient world. If you're even as a young boy or a young man, if your slave showed intellectual abilities, or the son of one of your slaves, you would have them educated because they were more valuable in that way. So, but in addition to that, we can compare Terence's intended audience with Plautus's intended audience. Terence is coming out of highly intellectual circles in ancient Rome, either as a favored slave or as a recently freed slave with connections to a wealthy Roman senator. Terence would himself have been in the company of well-heeled, well-educated Roman patricians. Now, having said that, so I think that that's one audience that he has in mind. But having said that, Terence's plays also did receive public performance on the makeshift stages at the various festivals. We know this, of course, directly from the man himself. I included the prologues in the course pack. I hope you read the prologues. They're actually quite funny. In one of the prologues, I think it's to the mother-in-law. He talks about how he was all set to begin his performance, and then all the crowd walked out because they heard there was a boxing match or a tightrope walker or something. So he's basically saying, "You unwashed plebeians, don't understand that you'd rather go have your lowbrow entertainment than enjoy my polished adaptations of Menander's plays." And they are polished adaptations of Menander's plays. And he, again, in his prologues, he actually, I mean, this is not a problem in Roman stage comedy. This was called when you took a play and you turned it around. That is to say, you took a Greek play, you took a play by Menander, and you turned it around so that it was approachable by a Latin speaking, obviously, but to a Roman audience. Okay, this is so the Latin verb is verso, which is I turn. But yeah, so verso. This is where we get our English words, or our English word version. So basically, what it means is that you're giving a Roman version of a Greek original. So, all right, so let's get into it with the plays. I think that's all I want to say about Terence and Terence's background. He lives between the Second Punic War and the Third Punic War, so it's not really worth going into detail about that right now. But I might talk about it a bit later. Let's start with so we're going to talk about the plays. Again, we're dealing with a very familiar cast of characters from New Comedy. These are upper middle class, property owning, well-to-do businessmen. That's the dad character, with young, overeducated, oversexed men. Young men for sons. And of course, we're dealing with the typical cast of slaves, scheming slave, running slave. We have a new character to consider. Though I could have talked about this with the braggart soldier. but we have the stock character of the parasite. So in the mother and no in the eunuch. So we have these two. So we also have a double plot going on in the eunuch because there's rival lovers for Thais, who is the courtesan, aka the hooker with the heart of gold. Both these plays feature that stock character. Um, but she's got two suitors, young Pamphilius, is that his name? I can't remember. Yeah, yeah. Oh, Pamphylia. Sorry, I should get that correct. Um, so young Pamphylia is in love with the courtesan Daaeus, but then there's this other character by the name of Thraso, who is our Miles Gloriosus, our braggart soldier stock character. And his slave is called Gnatho, and Gnatho exists simply to uh, flatter, praise, boost Thraso's ego. I'm sorry. I know that you. I know that it's tricky to get political because that's not my job and that's not why you're taking this class, to hear my political opinions. But I can't help but think with Thraso and Gnatho of Trump and Pence. Just like you got the braggart, and then you've got the guy who's there simply to tell him he's right all the time. So there you go. Based in real life, maybe not so stock after all, or actually maybe really stock. It depends on how you look at it. Okay, I'll shut up about that now. So Thraso is also after Thais, but Thais definitely prefers Pamphylia, and so Pamphylia or Thais is entertaining Thraso, which makes Pamphylia jealous, and so his slave, whose name is Parmeno, advises him to go to the country. Just go to the country for 3 days, and then come back. And but so Pamphylia is like, so here we go again with the city country thing, right? So this is indicative again. The Roman audience would inherently understand that in the city set in Athens, that's where the corruption happens, and indeed, Pamphylia has to be considered a corrupted young man because his dad is away on business, and while his dad's away on business, he's going after this prostitute, this courtesan, and we spending the family money and all that stuff, and but he only gets like around the corner, and then he's like, "Oh, I can't take myself away from her." Terence is young men, sons, who tend to be the main characters of the play. They tend to be, how can I put this? They tend to be a bit soft. They do a lot of crying. And they do a lot of complaining, and they're kind of, and again, a new comedy motif. They themselves, just as they are like deceiving their dads, so they are themselves easily deceived by their own slaves, their own servants. So they tend not to be, what do we call them now? Alpha males, or they're sensitive. They're sensitive guys. Not everybody has to be on the wrestling team. Not everybody has to not cry. It's okay to cry. Strong men also cry. So I'm not going to go. I don't want to get bogged down point by point. It's not that complicated. At the end of the day, um, wait a minute. Am I calling him Pamphilus? I got the wrong character there. It's Phaedria. I'm sorry. My apologies. See, I get look. I know new comedy. All these names, they all look alike, and because the characters themselves in the plays are generally fairly undistinguishable from one another. It's easy to confuse what character's name belongs where. Um, Though I will expect you to have it correct on your papers if you choose to write about this. So speaking of homecoming, the dad does eventually come home here, as does Phaedria's younger brother, Kyria, who's been off fighting war. So Kyria, the younger brother, is actually more of a kind of a recognizable uh, 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 type of masculinity. Um, I mean, what was Phaedria doing that time besides, crying in bed at night, probably? Um, so Phaedria has given Thais a gift. It's a eunuch. His name is Doris, which is funny, haha, to the ancient audience, because uh, well, yeah, Doris means spear in Greek. So for Terence's like upper class audience to have a eunuch named Spear would be funny to them. Okay, so but then meanwhile, yeah, Phaedria uh, has found in the marketplace, the slave marketplace, a young no, sorry, Thais has found a young girl in the marketplace, whom he believes to be the sister of what's the other character's name? I can't remember. Was that Cremes? Was that his name? Yeah, Pamphylia is the girlfriend of Antiphon, who's friends with Phaedria. Okay, so I don't know what that sound was. Um, when Kyria comes back, this is where we get to the second plot, and this is also where we come to the very large elephant in the room when it comes to discussing ancient comedy, but specifically Roman comedy, and that is the very touchy and sensitive um, subject of rape. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the dynamics of rape, both how I read it in the literary sense, but also why, in a larger sense, the Roman audience would have found it funny. So I hope this is I don't I hope this is not like personally upsetting to anybody. Um, but you can't. I mean, I would it would be irresponsible of me if I didn't address this topic. Okay, before we talk about how this works in Roman comedy, let's back up to our Greek stage comedy. There is certainly plenty of sexual violence in Aristophanes, um, both of the male-female variety and of the male-male variety. Um, if it's not acted out, or narrated directly, it's certainly heavily implied. We all know that, having read Aristophanes. What a filthy mind he had. And yeah, and so there is a precedent for it. Okay, as in all things, as in all things Roman comedy, uh, there's always going to be a precedent in earlier Greek comedy. Not so much of it in Menander, but it's still there. Um, But when we come down to the Romans, in both our two plays that we're discussing today, the mother-in-law and the eunuch, rape is a central plot point. Like, the plots don't get resolved if the rapes don't happen or didn't happen. In the eunuch, it happens during the play. In the mother-in-law, it happened before the dramatic action of the play. So let me talk about this word rape for a second. This comes from the Latin word raptum, which means, it literally means having been grabbed or having been seized. So, like, we get, besides the word, unpleasant word rape, we get other more pleasant words like rapt. In English from this, when you're totally taken by something, you're binge watching whatever you binge watch, I don't know. And you just, it's one after the other, you're rapt by it. And then, of course, rapture is another cognate here, too. But, of course, I'm dodging the question here, right? But ultimately, our English word rape. Okay, so in what sense is this acceptable? In what sense can this be considered funny in comedy? Well, you kind of have to understand. So here I'm going to step out of the literary context and go more into the social, one element of the social reality of Roman life. This is the late Republic period, so we're still pre-Empire. That doesn't start until the next century. In the Roman Republic, especially this period in the Roman Republic, there's a very strong emphasis on morality. There will always remain a strict emphasis on Roman values, the Roman value system, even into the empire. But in terms of actual practice, things change quite radically, especially after the death of the first emperor, Augustus. The name most closely associated with this, of course, is the office holder Cato. This is Cato the Elder, because his son went on to political office too. Who was well known for, like, Cato was a guy who endorsed the laws about what you could wear in public. Couldn't be too flashy, couldn't be too showy, even if you were a senator. So the Romans had legislation. So if you were a senator, what you got to do was, on your toga, you got to dye a purple stripe on it. Now we have legislation about how wide that purple stripe could be, because anything too wide is considered too ostentatious, too show-offy. Senators, above all people, should be setting standards of humility and reverence for the plebes, the populace, the populicus. And then there are what we call sumptuary laws. These are laws that restrict what kinds of foods you can eat. And because certain foods were considered to have a corrupting moral force because they were just too good, they were too rich, right? So you can have a joint of ham roasted over fire, but you can't spice it. You can't put honey on it. Like, you can't, like, just all. I mean, it kind of sounds weird to us, but it was a control mechanism. For the enforcement of ideas that were beneficial to the patrician class. It might not say that on Wikipedia, but that's my take on it at any rate. But then I tend to be more sort of anarcho in my political analysis of these things. Um, so getting back to what the subject, the elephant in the room. Um, there's also it was also expected restricted behavior on young men and young women before marriage. So you had very very little contact uh, as as a man, or as a young man, or as a young woman. You had very little contact with the opposite sex in daily life, because for the obvious reasons that for the obvious reasons. But there were some exceptions. There were times when you could uh, steal some quality time with a desired member or desirable member of the opposite sex, and those were at festivals. In particular, one festival, the Ludi Romani. I've already talked about this when I introduced Plautus, which was rather known for its drunkenness. And so, you know, what happens when teenagers get drunk, right? And I'm not saying that derisively. I mean, you're supposed to be married as a young man, uh, at least by your mid-20s. And of course, for women, the age is significantly younger than that. Like, especially again here, we're talking in the evidence that we have comes from our sources that really only report what goes on in the patrician class, because that's where the main literacy resides. So very little writing from Rome from somebody who is either not a member of the patrician class or not in the direct social circle of the Roman patrician class. So things happened at these festivals, and so for the Romans, what this concept of rape meant, it didn't, although it did mean to violent sexual assault, but it more broadly even meant any premarital sex, right? So kind of in the opposite of the way that our patriarchal thinking works today, where it's it's the woman's fault. It's always the boy's fault in the Roman world. Not because they had particularly enlightened opinions regarding gender relations, but rather because the woman couldn't possibly have had a say in this, because women aren't capable of making their own decisions. So it had to be the guy's fault. I think this is what we see in the more so in the mother-in-law than in the eunuch, because the rape scene in the eunuch is of a different nature. Chaerea, again, egged on by Parmenon, the clever, in this case not too clever but rather scheming slave, to get access, because he sees Pamphylia. I'm getting confused on my names again. Yes, he sees Pamphylia being brought back from the market with Thais, where she's had her other boyfriend Thraso purchase her for her as a gift, and again, comedy, love at first sight, or love might be too kind a term here, but he falls in love, and Parmenon says, "Well, I know how you can get in to see her. Dress up like a eunuch, because there's this new eunuch in their household, and he's away right now." So, because eunuchs would be, if you've ever watched Game of Thrones, you know that eunuchs are distinguished by their dress as much as anything else. Um, and So Kyria breaks into the house, right, and rapes Pamphylia. And then when he's caught in flagrante, he immediately hightails it out of there, runs out of there. And but I'm just going to stay in the play for a second. I'm going to wrap up talking about this rape scene. So it's notable for like it's the violence of the act, but it's also notable on the other hand that we actually, at least in this play, get the recorded reaction of the victim, and it's a sympathetic portrayal of the victim. She's crying, her hair is torn, she's bruised, and so I mean I don't know. I can't give you any easy resolution for this, and it's a complicated. Like there are a lot of complex strains at play here in terms of interpreting it. But in any case, he runs away in his unit clothes, and then when he tries to sneak back in his house, he sees his brother standing outside, so he can't go back in because why are you dressed like that? You know. But he eventually gets busted. Dad comes back. Now, the interesting thing about Dad coming back is there's one moment early in the play where Phaedria says, "Oh, I want to spend all my time with Thais. I wish Dad would never come back." Whoa, can't say that. Not in Rome. In Rome, Dad is the Jupiter of the household, right? So that's kind of as close as Terence comes to taking chances in terms of violating standard Roman mores. But Dad does come back, and then we have one of the most I think one of the most funny endings in Roman comedy, and indeed in all of ancient comedy. So like I mean I'm not a huge Terence fan, but I love the ending of this play because well, first we have to have the recognition scene, right? We have to have Pamphylia recognized as being a citizen by birth. Her brother shows up, and there's a recognition scene. And so, lo and behold, that makes her suitable marriage material for Kyria, who was another citizen. So we resolve that end of the plot there. So I guess that's I mean, I don't know. You don't get Pamphylia's opinion on this exactly, but like that's a happy ending. And then you have, but then you have the funny part is the resolution of the other plot, which is the love triangle between Thais, the prostitute, and moony young lover Phaedria and braggart soldier Thraso, which is resolved by them all agreeing that they can both visit Thais. So, okay. I hope not at the same time, but because then there would be violence. Okay, I'm going to stop talking about the eunuch now, and let's turn to the mother-in-law. This is another play. This is another baby mama drama. More that's a bit more kind of conventional than the structure of the eunuch. Okay, so our prostitute this time is Philotas, who's this time Parmeno is an old slave, We got two dads here who live next door to each other. Uh, and what's the girl's name? Philomena. Right. So the prologue delivered by the slave is telling the story um, of how Pamphilus's dad forced him into a marriage with the next door neighbor's daughter, who I don't think even gets a name in this play. Oh no, yeah, no, I just said it, Philomena, right? Um, and do do do, and so, but Pamphilus is really crushing hard on this courtesan called Bacchus, Bacchis, not to be confused with the god Bacchus, but this is Bacchus. Um, but his father basically thinks that it's time for Pamphilus to grow up now. Okay, you had your fun. Now it's time for you to become a serious Roman. I mean, not Roman, Athenian. No, like you see what's going on here is that we're taking these Greek plots and we're injecting them with the Roman social custom and the Roman social value system. Okay. But they're still set in Greece because these things wouldn't happen in Rome. Right. But the problem is that Philomena is pregnant, and everybody gets confused over who nobody knows who the real dad is. So Pamphilus takes this as a chance or as an excuse to say, well, I just can't marry her because she's already pregnant. No one knows who the dad is, so she's not marriage material. And so her dad sends her away. She goes to stay next door, and then there's this, and then the mothers-in-law play a role here too. We all know what the stock character of the mother-in-law will become. Um, you just say that. I mean, like there's a freaking car commercial that features a nagging mother-in-law. So like that's still with us. Or not car commercial, car insurance commercial, or just insurance commercial, whatever, doesn't matter. There's a commercial. So that stock character is still with us. Although Terence does paint a more sympathetic portrait. I mean, she comes one of the two wives. I'm not going to get into the names here partly because I can't remember them off the top of my head, and if I read them off the sheet, as soon as I take my eyes off the sheet, I'm going to confuse which one is which. So. You can find it in the Dramatis Personae, but one of them gives a speech about how women in general, but mothers-in-law in particular, are blamed for everything that goes wrong, but it's really not their fault. It's quite a sympathetic speech. Terence could be, well, I mean, you can see there is a sympathy. Generally, there's a kind of a general sense of humanity. Humanitas, the Latin word, humanitas, right? Which just means a sympathy and an understanding for other people. In fact, Terence's probably most famous quote of all is when one of his characters says, "I am human, and I don't think anything else that is human is foreign to me," which is, he actually uses the word alienus, so alien. But what he means is that with the character, and this kind of clip that line out, and that's a sort of standard, like one line, standard. By standard, I mean like grossly oversimplified. Take on Terence's plays in general. But having said that, I also do find at times a certain humanity. He could have made the mothers-in-law the villains of the play, um, but he doesn't really do that. So that's nice of him. Marina's one of them. Don't worry about it. I'm not gonna. Sostra's the other one. So how do we resolve this? Pamphilus is still, romantically involved with Bacchus. So Laches actually, goes to get Bacchus to oh my gosh, I just forgot. I forgot. Oh my gosh. Okay, no. Pamphilus and Philomena are already married, right? But but Pamphilus refused to um, make the marriage official, to consummate the marriage, because he was mad at his dad and because he was in love with Bacchus. But then, so then when she starts to show, when she gets a bump, then the automatic assumption is, well, we've A, it's only been like 7 months, and B, we haven't had sex. So, this is obviously pre-Christian. So Bacchus comes back, and we resolve all this, of course, in a recognition scene, right? And this time with a recognition token, because of course we do. And the way the recognition token here, what the recognition token here is that it turns out that Pamphilus too is one of our comic rapists, and as I mean, again, what a scumbag! He actually steals the ring off the girl he raped, and then he gives it as a present to his girlfriend, Bacchus. Yeah, I've already gone down that road. I'm not going to go down that road again. And what's more than that, Bacchus actually swears an oath that she and Pamphilus haven't had sex either since the marriage. So there's a lot of kind of correction of moral standing going on here. And then, of course, it's Bacchus who recognize, or who, wait, did I get that? Yeah, it's Bacchus who facilitates because they see her ring and they're like, that's hers. That's Philomena's ring. Remember, she got raped and it got stolen. And it's on Bacchus's finger. So it's actually the Bacchus character who's the character of the lowest social standing outside of the slave, and who becomes the facilitator of the recognition itself in an irony. So yeah. So I'm just going to wrap up here quickly and do a real quick overview of. I'm just going to compare and contrast Greek old comedy with new comedy, both Greek and Roman, just so we can be clear on these things. Let's see if I need a new sheet of paper. I may not, because I think I probably talked about these things. So as you can see, there are things that don't change. Recognition scenes, they don't change. The happy ending, that doesn't change. Though Euripides toys with that a little bit in his tragic comedies, but that's technically outside the canon, so we won't talk about that. I'm thinking specifically, of course, of the Ion, which kind of has a happy ending, but has, again, one of those strange endings where, like that's not, well, anyway, we talked about that. right, and to a certain extent, there will always be some kind of violence in comedy. I mean, who doesn't like a good pie in the face, after all? Now, that, of course, diminishes over time as we get into new comedy. Um, so, one of the things that we have to look at here is that I am gonna go on for longer than I intended to. I now realize. Um, so I'm gonna talk about this briefly. I think I already covered this material, at least in the first part of the as it is due. With respect to Greek Old Comedy, remember we talked about how highly politicized Greek Old Comedy is, and how that, in and of itself, is a function of direct political self determination. Right? Aristophanes was free; it's actually protected by a law to talk about the contemporary issues of the day and individuals who were around during that day, political leaders or public figures or whatever Socrates was. I suppose he falls under public figure. So, um, excuse me. So I think that becomes part of the kind of DNA of early parts of Greek comedy. Then we had the Athenian collapse at the end of the Peloponnesian War, and then life in Athens isn't quite so rosy as it once was. They're not quite the dominant power that they once were. They'd seen the democracy fall. It's been restored now, but they just kind of come through this period where there was no democracy. And I sense that DNA mutates into something that is more, um, it becomes more situational, right? So certainly by the time we get to Menander, we get to a comedy that is virtually apolitical. Um, and again, because we talked about the rise of Alexander, and then that marks the real kind of, at least I think in a psychological sense, the real end of the Athenian political self determination. Um, not formally, but in the just in the way that you view yourself amongst the rest of the world. Okay, and then of course you get down to the Romans, and they clean it up even further. So anything that is like slapstick and Menander, it kind of gets more sort of like, I overheard somebody, I overheard those prostitutes talking, and now I'm mad, or even Pam in the mother-in-law's an overheard uh, statement that Philomena makes that's overheard by one of the dads that causes him to run her out of the house, right? So it's situational rather than being topical. Okay, that's a good way to put it. Old comedy deals with topics, contemporary topics, whereas new comedy borrows its humor from tricky situations that everyday, uh, well-to-do Romans like us find ourselves in. But again, these motifs, I mean, look, our modern sitcoms. I mean, it would be so easy to take a play of Terence and adapt it into like an episode of Three's Company. You really wouldn't have to change much at all. Um, I know that's a dad reference, but surely you know what Three's Company is. Uh, yeah. Or even like Friends or something like that. I mean, look at all the like mistaken intentions that form plots of Friends, or for that matter, Seinfeld. But those are kind of zanier situations. But the dynamic remains the same. So the spirit of Aristophanes is not dead. I think I've already talked about this, so it won't surprise you that this is my opinion. But the spirit of Aristophanes survives in South Park. It's musical. It's totally inappropriate in terms of its language. They have absolutely no qualms about taking on contemporary figures, and they have been I think they've been sued over it too, and won. Or certainly they've been threatened with legal action. Um, and so we still have both kinds of comedy around. And generally, yeah, okay, all right, I must shut up about that now. So that's Terence and Roman New Comedy. What are we doing next? We are doing Horace. We're doing, okay, so the next lecture will be another twofer. I'm going to cover Roman satire with the selections out of Horace's satires and Juvenal satires. Again, two very different kinds of poets from, as far as we can tell, two very different social strata. Good. All right. Be safe, wash your hands, and don't